And I thought, that seems to me completely bankrupt and worthless. What is the point of this thing if all we're doing is reporting how a bunch of Oxford students and faculty talk? And I was lost. In fact, I sold my guitar and I bought a copy of the entire Talmud. I was reading it much younger, so I read the stuff about God's existence, and that got me really interested in the logic of arguments. I and a friend went to the headmaster, the same one who gave me the philosophy book, and said, we want to start our own countercultural magazine.
I am beyond honored today to be joined by Professor Paul Franks. He is the chair of philosophy at Yale University and one of the leading scholars in German idealism and Jewish philosophy. He has a book about it called All or Nothing. He earned his bachelor's degree at Oxford University and his PhD in philosophy from Harvard. He has shaped the field of philosophy through his teachings as well as his research, and I hope you enjoy his words of wisdom as much as I did.
Good afternoon. Today I am joined here by Professor Paul Franks, who is the head of the philosophy department here at Yale University. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so pleased to have you here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you got to where you are in life and your journey to kind of help a younger audience understand what it takes to be in this field. So why don't we start off with how you got interested in this field of philosophy?
Well, I think I should start by saying that I had a double education. So on the one hand, I had a very traditional English education. On the other hand, I had a very traditional Jewish education. And it's the intersection of those two things that got me interested in philosophy. In the first place, because I noticed that there were different sorts of reasoning going on in the part of my day when I was at the English school and in the part of my day when I was at the Jewish school. And I wasn't sure what to make of that. And I thought maybe there were different kinds of reason. And I read a book called The Incomplete Enchanter, which is a sort of a fantasy book, but it involves logic, the idea of logic. And in this book, if you somehow got a logical system imprinted in your mind, you could be in that world. And I thought maybe there was a way to map the different logics of the English part of my day and the Jewish part of my day, which was largely devoted to studying Talmud, and then I would understand. And that project didn't work, but it taught me a lot, because in order to try the project, I had to understand something about formal logic and then come to see the limits of formalization and why. So even learning why that wasn't really going to help me very much was quite helpful.
It was very interesting how you got into that. Was that, how old would you say you were?
I was probably between 12 and 14. But there was another part to it as well, which is that when I had my bar mitzvah at the age of 13, it's a time when in traditional Jewish circles, you receive a library of books as gifts. And one of the books I received was a philosophy book, which is really read for its expressions of piety more than the philosophy. And the person who gave it to me said, "You won't understand this yet, so don't even bother trying." And that really annoyed me. So I thought, I have to read this now. And had I waited till I was older, I would have been told by my teachers, skip the beginning where they try to prove God's existence. Just assume God exists and then go from there. But I was reading it much younger, So I read the stuff about God's existence, and that got me really interested in the logic of arguments. And I also, on the other side of life, my mother and her family came from Germany to England in 1938, and they brought their books with them. And my mother had studied German philosophy and literature. And she was not an academic or anything. She was a mother and a homemaker, but she really was interested in this. And she and I, we spoke a lot of German at home. So she and I read German poetry and things together. But I had seen that Kant had refuted all the arguments for God's existence that I had read in the other book. And I wanted to know what Kant said. And my grandfather's copies of Kant's works were in our library at home. So I said to my mother, can we read this together? And she said, well, it's hard. And she wasn't sure she understood what was going on, but she was a native German speaker. So I said, well, you help me with the vocabulary and I'll try and figure out what's going on. So we started to read it together at that point. So that was also somewhere between 13, 14, something like that.
So it's sort of a family tradition and sort of runs in the family of like learning philosophy, would you say?
Yes, although I don't know how much my grandfather read of it, because I was too young when he died to ask him. He was definitely somebody who wanted to be an intellectual. He had to leave school when he was 10. He was an orphan. And until my mother, nobody had been to university yet. This was an aspiration.
Right.
So there was a strong Jewish educational background, but they couldn't really go to university. Jews were not permitted to go to university in Germany until quite late in the 19th century. And even though they were permitted, they didn't have the money to do that, and it wasn't really something that it wasn't a real possibility.
Right.
But for my mother's generation, it was already an aspiration.
And you mentioned that you grew up in Newcastle in England. How would you say that your environment at the time sort of shaped your thinking and your passions, if at all?
Well, it was an unusual setting, in fact. I mean, Newcastle is a lovely city in the northeast of England, but there were two things about it. Number one, there was a group of Jews from Lithuania who had settled there starting in the late 19th century, and that's my father's background. And they had brought with them the strong emphasis on scholarship, Jewish scholarship, that existed in Lithuania. So it was the only place outside of Eastern Europe where a yeshiva, an advanced Talmud college, existed that was part of a sort of franchise from Lithuania. That already existed. The second thing that happened, and this is basically the story of my parents, right, is that my mother's family was recruited from Germany. They were the first of about 40 families. So a group of British civil servants who were very attuned to what was going on in Nazi Germany were also working for the development of the British economy. And this was suffering Great Depression. The Northeast was dependent on coal mining, iron and steel and shipbuilding, and those basically collapsed during the early 1930s. And then Hitler rose and anti-Semitism became much worse in Germany. So these civil servants had the idea to go to Germany and find German Jews who wanted to leave and who had expertise in light industry. And my grandfather and his brother had a factory in Munich. They were orphans who had built their way up, and they understood how to manufacture clothing. So they were able to get in touch with this British civil servant through the consul in Munich, and they were able to negotiate with the Nazis, not easy, and they left and came to England. So I was now in this setting where you had Jews from Lithuania focused on Talmud scholarship, and German Jews, like my mother's family, who were deeply immersed in German culture, but were also very traditional Jews. And this together created an environment which now made it the center of Jewish scholarship in Europe. So it didn't start out that way, but because of the Second World War and refugees coming, it became really central. So I had, as I say, these two educations. I went to a traditional British grammar school, which is celebrating its 500th anniversary this year. And I also went through this high-level Talmud education. And had I lived anywhere else, I probably wouldn't have had both of those. And as I say, for me, I know some kids found the tension was really annoying. For me, it was intellectually stimulating.
Right. So would you say you were in an environment where you were pushed to pursue those academic interests?
Yes, and my parents were very committed to my having a really good education in both areas, but they were also very insistent that I should go to university. Mm-hmm. And that was changing a bit. The people who went in the Talmud education route were not going to university anymore. Right. They were just staying within the sort of Jewish bubble. And my parents made me promise that I would go to university. So I studied only Talmud after high school, but only for 1 year. Right. And then I had to leave and go to university. And I maintained my studies of Talmud at the same time, but for most people that didn't really happen.
Right. A little bit more about your time at grammar school.
Yes.
What subjects did you take, and how did that system work, and how did it set you up for eventually attending college at Oxford?
So it was still the system where you take what were then called O-levels, well, I think it's GCSE now.
Yes.
About the age of 15 or 16. I was a year young for my age, I took about 15. And then A-levels for university admission. And in those days, if you were going to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to take another set of exams for Oxford and Cambridge entrance exams, and I did that. So for A-levels, I chose to do politics, history, and English. And the main reason I did politics was because I was already deeply committed to philosophy, and you couldn't do philosophy. But politics included political science and political philosophy. So that's the first thing that I studied. So I had already been interested, for the reasons that I mentioned, in philosophy, but then there were people at my school, teachers, who also had studied philosophy at Oxford, and they encouraged me, including the headmaster of the school. And he gave me a copy of Language, Truth and Logic by A.J. Ayer, because he thought it would cure me of religion, which did not work, but it was a good thing for us to discuss. And I still teach that material as well, logical positivism.
So you maintained it for a long time, that knowledge and love for philosophy.
Yes.
Wow.
And the school was great. I really enjoyed the school. It's one of the old British grammar schools. It's changed a lot now. I was back there last year, and I visited the archives for various reasons. But my family had a long association with the school. One of my uncles went, and two of my nephews, and many of my cousins. And we did a lot of Latin, which I still use. And I thought it was a terrific education, really.
Would you say that the school itself was rigorous in its academics, and how did you balance that with time for like leisure activities, say like personal reading or time with family and stuff like that?
It was a very rigorous school, very demanding, which was fine. Honestly, I didn't have much time for leisure activities because I was leaving school and then going to this other education.
Right. Yeah.
So I didn't have much time for extracurricular things. But when I did this, and if it involved the school, then the school was helpful. So for example, there was an official school magazine, which is still around today, but I'm from the punk rock generation, and we thought that what was happening in the city and in the country in general was not being covered in the school magazine. So I and a friend went to the headmaster, the same one who gave me the philosophy book, and said, we want to start our own countercultural magazine. Could we we don't need much money, but can we just use the copying machine and that sort of thing? And they supported us to do that. So we started a magazine called Litmus. So it was literature and music, and also the litmus test of criticism. And we published a few editions of that, which was not very good, but it was fun. So the school was very supportive, even if it was something that challenged the establishment.
And for how long did you maintain the Litmus magazine?
Not more than 2 years, maybe 18 months to 2 years. Because the problem is that they always got exams coming up. So this was in between O levels or GCSE and A levels. So at some point, everything else had to stop and we had to focus on those exams.
You mentioned to me that you were in a punk rock band. Would you
Yeah.
say that writing in this magazine about music in it as well, do you think that sort of inspired, being this band? And what was your role? I would love
It was all part of the same thing. There was, I think every generation has, hopefully, a moment of excitement and the feeling that they're doing something new and authentic. And that was my generation's moment, starting around 1976, 77. And it was an exciting time. Before that, I think we felt we were in the shadows of our older sisters and brothers who lived through the 60s. I was young in the 60s. I was excited about it, but I was too young to go to concerts. And my brother-in-law saw the Beatles when I was barely alive, so I couldn't do that. And it seemed at the beginning as though all the great music and all the great cultural events had already happened. So punk was our moment when we were doing something, and that was very exciting. So the magazine and playing in bands and things, that was all part of the same thing. But I was trying to juggle that with my very traditional observant life as well, which was pretty unusual.
Right.
That was the unusual part.
And did you put a pause on these activities indefinitely when it was time to study for your final?
I did. And in fact, I sold my guitar and I bought a copy of the entire Talmud instead. And I thought, this is what I'm going to focus on. I got another guitar later. And my wife bought me a guitar when we got married, so I still play. But at that time, it felt like I can't do all these things and be really good at all of them.
Right.
So I gave that up. And also, things were happening at punk concerts that I didn't want to be involved in.
Right. And what year was it that when you finished your exams, and what was the year that you applied to Oxford, and what was that process like?
Right, so that was 1982. So I took my A-level exams in the summer of 82, and then I started studying at the yeshiva, at the Talmud College. And then in order to do what was called the third year sixth, to prepare for the Oxford exams, I had to go back to school for a few weeks. It wasn't the whole term, I don't remember how many weeks it was, but just to practice with old exams. There was a general exam, and then there was a philosophy exam. I don't remember that there was anything else. Maybe there was a politics exam as well. And because I was applying to do PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. And so there was the written exam, and then I went back to the yeshiva again, and then I waited to hear the results. And then the next stage was if they wanted you to come for an interview, you had to go to Oxford. So I went to Oxford, and with a friend of mine, my school sends a lot of people to Oxford and Cambridge every year, and I think our year was the record year. So in the end, there were about probably 30 of us out of a class of about 100 who ended up getting into Oxford and Cambridge. And I went to the interview, and that went went well. That was exciting. I met someone who became a very important teacher for me, and then I came home, and I again I was back in the yeshiva, and I was waiting for the results.
And then after you eventually started college, why was it Balliol specifically that you attended?
So I applied to Yale for several reasons. I didn't really understand the different levels of prestige. In fact, it was one of the more prestigious clubs, but that wasn't really why I wanted to go. First of all, Yale was very famous for philosophy, and it had been for a long time. I didn't really know what that meant, but it just seemed like everybody, when I looked up people's biographies, famous philosophers in Britain had gone to Yale. So that seemed good to me. And then I had a sort of romantic reason for going, because I really loved the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Even though he was obviously different religion from me, but the religious sentiment, the expression, and the use of language I thought was absolutely brilliant. And he went to Yale. So that was really the two reasons. A lot of decisions in my life I feel like I made, maybe it's always like this, without very much information. And you know, it was different then. Now, somebody mentions something and I go and I look it up, just Google it, you know.
Right.
I had no clue about anything. And my parents, or my mother had gone to Oxford, but she studied German in the 1950s. She didn't know anything about it. Nobody at school really told me anything. I had no information. It was even worse when later on, so I finished at Oxford and I moved to Harvard to do my PhD. I didn't even know who was teaching at Harvard. I'd heard of Harvard. And I knew like one fact about it, but you couldn't just look it up in those days. It's hard to believe now.
Right.
Information is so readily available.
Yeah. Must have been tough to move to college with not much information.
But that was just taken for granted, and I didn't know what I was missing. And I've been very lucky because those decisions really worked out. They might not have done, but they did work out.
So how was your time at Oxford different from your school days in terms of like academic rigor, and did you have time to pursue your other interests in college, would you say?
So, you know, the way the Oxford system works, it's all tutorial based. You do not have to go to lectures if you're in the humanities. You can, but you don't have to. And I had tutorials usually twice a week in 2 different subjects, and it was either me with one other person or just me. Mainly it was just me. And you know, I'd be given a broad topic for the week, and then I would go and sit in the library and read and think. I would write a paper. The topic was usually not dictated, just the area. And then I would read that paper to my tutor, who would then tear it to pieces and tell me it was complete rubbish. And that was good education in many ways. What I felt was missing from that was really learning something from a person. And when I went to Harvard, that was one of the reasons why I did it. But I really wanted to sit at the feet of wise people and learn from them. And it wasn't like that in Oxford.
Right.
But I did go to some lectures by good philosophers too. They just weren't really part of what I was supposed to be studying. But the tutorial system worked well for me. I think it assumes that you're very self-motivated, that you don't mind sitting in the library for a week without any guidance. It gave me flexibility because, as I said before, I maintained my Talmud studies during that time as well. So I had the day divided into parts, and you know, I would have a sort of Talmud study session, sometimes with other people, sometimes just on my own. Then I'd do some philosophy work, and then I'd have another Talmud study session. I was able to do that. So that was good. It worked well for me, and socially I enjoyed it a lot. When I first got there, I thought I'm going to do everything, and I didn't, and that probably was a wise decision in the end. So I'm a very political person, but I couldn't in the end get involved in as much politics. I was involved in some politics, mainly within Balliol College. That was the third thing, I suppose, that attracted me to it. Balliol was very well known for left-wing intellectual discussion. And I loved that. I probably was there just after that had hit its peak. It was probably more famous for it earlier in the 60s and 70s, but it was still going on. And you know, in each Oxford college there's a junior common room, which is where the undergraduates gather, sometimes for fun and sometimes to debate things. In some colleges the debate is over which beer to buy. But in Balliol the debate is, you know, what exactly is the mix of capitalism and socialism that we should have in the economic system? Or what do we think about Irish nationalism? Or, you know, I was involved in, I and a friend and a Palestinian student put together a plan for two states for Israel and Palestine. And that had not yet been really, it was not a mainstream position yet, but we sort of negotiated it out. And of course that had no impact on anybody, but it was an interesting experience. The Palestinian student with whom I did that works at the United Nations now. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff going on, and some of the people involved in those debates actually had political careers afterwards as well. So that I enjoyed that, but I only did it within the college. I could have been a member of the larger political party debates or the union, and I just didn't have time for that as well.
Right. Would you say that you spent 3 years there?
Yes.
Right? So would you say that your attitudes towards the subject changed throughout the years?
Okay. Well, I actually got disillusioned with, not with philosophy itself, but with the way it was done. And there was a reason for that. The sort of philosophy that I had learned how to do when I was still at school, before Oxford, was really ordinary language philosophy, which had been quite important in England in the 40s and 50s. It was a bit outdated, but that was because I learned quite a lot from one of my Latin teachers who had been to Oxford. So I sort of learned how to do philosophy as an extension of Latin grammar. You know, so if you're asking, do we have freedom of the will? An ordinary language way to approach that would be say, well, when do we actually use the word free, or when would I say I chose freely, and when would I say I was coerced to do it? And that would at least be the starting point. You do a sort of grammatical analysis. But that was quite outdated, and when I got to Oxford, although my teacher, Alan Montefiore at Balliol, who was wonderful, he was used to that way of thinking, but it was not the main thing that was going on anymore. Oxford philosophy, under the influence of America, had taken this move towards formal logic, and in particular formal semantics. And I was not so deeply interested in that. As I mentioned before, already in my teenage years, I had studied quite a lot of logic, and so I went to a more advanced level at Oxford. But I didn't really think that was the answer to the kind of questions that I wanted to ask. And then at some point at Balliol, I wrote a paper, and it was on freedom of the will, from an ordinary language point of view. And my teacher, Alan, who passed away just a few months ago, gave me a very hard time for it, which shook me up. Because in an ordinary language approach, you will say things like, this is what we say. And Alan said to me after I read the paper, he said, who the hell are you to speak for me? Who is this we of whom you talk? And I had no answer whatsoever. I didn't really know. It was just the method I had learned, and I didn't really have a good foundation for it. And then Alan told me a story that he went to a philosophy meeting, a famous philosophy meeting, around 1950 in France, and there was, you know, all the French philosophers and the English-speaking philosophers got together, and it's the origin of division between so-called continental European philosophy and analytic philosophy in many ways. And there wasn't good communication between them. And one of the main founders of ordinary language philosophy was J.L. Austin, who was at Oxford. And he gave a paper in French, actually. And one of the French philosophers asked him the same question that Alan asked me. He said, "Who is this we?" And Alan told me that Austin's reply was, "I mean by we, those of my peers at Oxford who agree with me." And he said that, Alan told me, with a smirk. And I thought, that seems to me completely bankrupt and worthless. What is the point of this thing if all we're doing is reporting how a bunch of Oxford students and faculty talk, and I was lost. I didn't want to do the formal approach that a lot of graduate students were into. I no longer understood what I was doing when I appealed to ordinary language. I didn't know what to do. Now, I still wanted to study Kant, and I had done that some more. So I thought, that's what I'll do, and I'll try and figure it out. So I applied to Harvard, and one of the reasons I did that, because I knew that Dieter Henrich, who was the leading German philosopher in the area of Kant and Hegel, was visiting there regularly. I didn't really want to go to Germany, but I thought if I go to Harvard, I can still do English language philosophy, but I can have the best of German philosophy as well. When I got there, he cancelled his classes. And the second year, he wasn't coming back. I got to know him later on. It was because of the breakup of a relationship and custody of a daughter, but I didn't know any of that. All I knew was I was now at Harvard and I didn't know what I was doing. And I was interested in early analytic philosophy. That was great. And there was this guy who I'd heard of called Stanley Cavell. But I didn't really understand what he did. And I had nothing to do because Henrich wasn't there. So I went to Cavell's seminar on Freud. Why not? And it completely blew me away. It was brilliant, and it was everything. I thought, if I'm going to study with this guy, I have to learn psychoanalysis and Hollywood films and everything else. So I got some of his books, and I realized that he had an answer to the question Alan had asked me. So Cavell, in The Claim of Reason, which is one of his major books from 1979, says that the question of who we are in ordinary language is a political question. If I say what we say, I'm making a search for community and for people who agree with me, not agree in an opinion or a judgment, but are attuned with me, where Cavell was a musician, who are able to sort of improvise with me like members of a jazz band. And I thought, this is amazing. This actually answers the question. And Cavell explained that in terms of Kant, in terms of Kant's third critique and Kant's aesthetics. So this completely changed everything because it gave me a Kantian foundation for the kind of ordinary language philosophy that I knew how to do. And it put it all in a political context. So then that was wonderful, and Stanley became my teacher and my close mentor, and I was very lucky to find him.
So it opened up a whole new world for you,
Yeah.
almost. So I want to backtrack a little bit to kind of explore your shift from Oxford to Harvard and how you got there. So you graduated with your undergrad degree and a master's degree in PPE, correct?
Yes.
And after you graduated with your master's as well, what kind of, did you have the plan to go to Harvard? I mean, did you find that out already that you wanted to study from him?
Yeah, I applied during my final year at Oxford. There was no gap.
All right. And what was that process like?
Again, I had no real information. I don't remember how I even got the forms to apply. I talked to Alan Montefiore about it, and he knew something about the department. Somehow I got the application forms, I don't know. I filled them in, I got letters of recommendation. I had to go and take the GRE, which was the standardized test. I was the only person in the north of England taking it, and I had to take a train down to Leeds, and I sat in some scientist's lab while she did her experiments, and she was being paid to supervise the exam. I didn't even know what it was. I didn't prepare for it, and it seemed very basic. It was, because it wasn't based on content, it was just like high school mathematics. So I did well enough in that. It was okay, but the whole thing was bewildering. I don't remember how I even knew I had to take it. Someone must have advised me about that. And I applied to 3 universities. I applied to Harvard, Berkeley, and Princeton because I'd heard of them. I didn't know anywhere else. Princeton wrote me a letter saying, we don't have anybody who works on Kant and Hegel, so there is no point in admitting you. Harvard and Berkeley both admitted me. And I decided on Harvard for the reasons that I said, because Dieter Henrich was there. And that was very fateful because I met Cavell. I also knew the work of Hilary Putnam, which I was very excited about. So he became a close teacher of mine at Harvard as well. And I had read him already. I didn't understand Cavell when I was a student at Oxford, so I picked up his book, but I didn't get it. But Hilary's book, Reason, Truth and History, I really liked. And that gave me the idea that analytic philosophy was developing in the direction of a conversation with Kant and Hegel. And that turned out to be correct. So I was part, in the 90s already, of this turn in analytic philosophy, which might be called post-Kantian analytic philosophy or analytic German idealism. And that also was very fortuitous. And quite a number of the people who were interested in that worked with Cavell and Putnam, so they remain my colleagues to this day. A lot of my friends to this day are people I met at Harvard in graduate school.
Would you say that for your own philosophical views, Kant and Hegel have a big influence on them because you've studied them so deeply?
Yes, absolutely. Although now, I mentioned Kant and Hegel because they're the most famous ones. But I'm actually I've written a lot about Fichte and Salomon Maimon, and now I'm working a great deal with Schelling. Slightly less famous, but very prominent German idealist as well.
Very interesting. I was also wondering if, the English culture and American culture are quite different. Would you say that it had any effect on how you were able to go about, your academics at all?
Well, it was definitely a bit of a culture shock when I first came to America as a student. Things were very different. As I mentioned before, I chose to do it because I wanted to study with well-established philosophers in a way that I didn't think I could if I stayed in England. I could have gone straight to the DPhil in England and written a thesis, or I could have done the MPhil, which is doing some courses. But at least at that time, graduate work in philosophy was less well established. Now it's very well established in England, but it was not very well established at that point, whereas in America, graduate school was. So I had 2 years of coursework in the American system, and then I started to teach. Again, that's something a bit different from I would have done in the British system. Sort of apprentice teaching, I suppose, being a teaching assistant. And that was good for me as well. So I learned a lot from the people I taught for. I was a teaching assistant for Cavell's course, which eventually became a book called Cities of Words, about moral perfectionism. I learned a lot from that. So the whole experience at Harvard was great. I know it was hard for some people because Harvard is a big place, and the professors, especially the famous professors, they were at the top of Mount Olympus. They were the gods, and we were way down in the foothills. But I was somewhat fortunate, and I was able to get Cavell's and Putnam's attention fairly early, and we had very good relationships.
Sounds incredible. Were you a teaching assistant during your studies?
Yes.
All right.
After the second year.
Okay.
That's part of how graduate study is funded in American system. So you get 2 years usually of paid coursework, but then in return for that, you teach for a couple of years.
So right after you finished your PhD, what was your plan for after that?
Oh, okay. Well, so before you finish your PhD, usually you go on the job market. And in those days, so this would have been 1993, 92, 93, it was pretty standard to try to go to a tenure track job straight out of graduate school, and very uncommon to go and have a postdoc. But there was an exception to that, which was the Society of Fellows. And there were only 2 at that time, now there are more. There was one at Harvard, and there was one at Michigan. And the idea of the Society of Fellows was that you would have 3 years, basically free of other obligations, just to pursue your research. And it was an interdisciplinary thing, so it was people from all different, and you'd basically be put together, with a physicist and a biologist and whatever, a psychologist or whoever it was, and then you would meet regularly to talk about your research. So I was nominated for the Harvard Society, which Cavell had been a member of, but the head of the society told me, look, the mathematicians are leaving the former USSR. You're not going to get anything this year. So I was rather sad about that. And fortunately, I did get the Michigan Society of Fellows Fellowship. And that was a fantastic experience for 3 years after the PhD. So I didn't apply for any jobs yet. I only applied on Cavell's advice for the Society of Fellows positions. And then I was in Ann Arbor for 3 years.
So what was your research about while you were in the society?
So it really gave me a great opportunity to change things a little bit, I must say, because my dissertation project was very specific to the philosophical debates that were going on at Harvard at the time, and to my personal interests. So it combines German idealism, ordinary language philosophy, and Jewish philosophy. And that was a very unusual combination. And this gave me an opportunity, these 3 years, to develop that project in a way that people who were looking to hire somebody could understand. So I made the project about philosophical method, and in particular the method that is known as transcendental argument, which has often been said in analytic philosophy to be the method of Kant and maybe of Hegel, and so it turned into that, and that was much discussed at the time, big discussion. And it meant that when I did go on the job market, while I had the fellowship, I was able to explain what my project was, instead of giving some complicated story that was specific to Cavell's work in conversation with Jewish philosophy.
So is that when you published your book eventually?
No. It took me a while to publish the book. I published some articles at this point.
Right, okay.
I published an article on transcendental arguments because I went to a conference and met someone who became a very close friend of mine,
Okay.
Bob Stern, who was teaching at Sheffield. And we met at a conference at Dartmouth. So he was also British and Jewish and working on the same things. He's a few years older than me. And we drove in a van from Dartmouth to Boston and had a great conversation. And he said, well, I'm going to have a conference on transcendental arguments next year in England, and I want you to come. So that was a fantastic experience. And that article probably got me a job, and it came out in the book that he edited. I will just say, I miss Bob a lot. He died last year, and he had been my guest here at Yale for half a year in 2022. We co-taught a seminar, which was fantastic, and he was a great guy. So that, that's what my research was sort of primarily on. And then I was also still doing a lot of things connected to Cavell. So, for example, Cavell's work was translated into French around that time, and people started getting excited about him there. So I went with him, and so did other people, to this big conference in France about his work, and I gave a paper there, and we got connected to this new network of people in France. And at the same time, I started going to Germany and giving papers there on German philosophy.
Right. You mentioned that France has a different attitude towards philosophy than Americans do. How do you think that impacted sort of your view on it, and if it impacted your work at all?
So my teacher, Alan Montefiore, who died quite recently, his wife is French, and he was also pretty much bilingual. He was the only person in Oxford who was very much in touch with French philosophy. So I couldn't really study it at Oxford yet. Now you could, but it wasn't possible. But Alan knew all about it, and he edited a book called Contemporary French Philosophy, which I read. So we did discuss that a bit, and I had some idea of what was going on in France. And it was fascinating, but really quite separate from the British or American tradition at that time. Now it's changed a bit. I think there's quite a number of philosophers in France who are doing analytic philosophy. And there's this group of people who are interested in Cavell. It's a whole group who I only got to know during the mid-90s, and I'm still in touch with them.
Would you say that at the time, would you say that philosophy was more prominent and celebrated in Europe? And do you think that perhaps a career in philosophy in Europe might have had more opportunities than in America?
I don't know that it had more opportunities, but it's a very different situation. In France, I'm not sure that it's entirely true now, but it was still true in the 90s, that philosophy is in the public domain. Philosophers are covered in newspapers. It was still the idea of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, so people who are known, and that is a little bit true in Britain, but not true at all in America. In America, if you're fortunate enough to have a university job, philosophy is well supported, but even the most educated non-philosopher on the street has probably not heard of the major American philosophers. I grew up in Britain watching philosophy on the television and on the radio, which is rare in America, but in France it's a big deal. And when I came to this event with Cavell, it was covered by Le Monde, and there were all these journalists, and Stanley found that quite strange, because nobody would have, from the newspapers, covered him in Boston or New York.
So, I mean, given the difference in how it is here and how it is in Europe, what made you decide to stay in America?
I don't know, like a lot of things in my life, I'm not sure how much of a decision it was. So my first job was in America, and I had married an American woman. That was a large part of it. And there weren't a lot of, in the 90s, there were no jobs in philosophy, very few, in England. And that's the only thing I was thinking about, so either going back to England or staying in America. So for the time being, there were jobs in America, and I stayed. I thought I would probably go back to England. And then we left. My wife's also an academic, and we after a few years teaching in Indiana, we moved to Toronto, and we both taught at the University of Toronto. And we came back to the United States in 2011 because Yale recruited us. So a lot of it has not to do with some very well thought out decision, so much as opportunities that arise, and then once you have a family, question of where my wife wanted to be, and where we wanted our children to be educated.
So just to give a bit of timeline to things, after your graduation from Harvard, you went to Michigan in Ann Arbor for 3 years, and after that What was your?
Then I got a tenure track job at Indiana University.
All right.
And my wife, who was a few years behind me at Harvard, finished her PhD and got a job at the University of Notre Dame, which is also in the state of Indiana. And when our first child was born in 1999, I was still commuting from the north to the south of the state. And then Notre Dame offered me a job, and Indiana offered my wife a job, and we wanted to be in one place. Less complication once you've got babies is a good thing. And I ended up moving to Notre Dame. So we were there for a few years. We both got tenure at Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's a great university, but South Bend, Indiana has limited educational possibilities. It has some good ones, but not extensive the way you get in a big city. So when University of Toronto was interested in both of us, we thought that would probably be better for the kids. So we moved to Toronto.
And how long were you guys in Toronto for?
7 years.
And how did that process of getting recruited by University of Toronto work? Was it picked up, or did you apply?
I think I realized this doesn't always happen, but I knew people there on faculty who wrote to me and said, we're going to have this position and we think that both of you would be good for different parts of the university. Are you interested in applying? And we did.
Would you say that was the best decision for your career, or was it helpful to your career in any way?
Well, Toronto was great. It's a fantastic department. I still go there pretty often, and my wife ended up building the Center for Jewish Studies, and it worked out great for us. We moved not because we didn't want to be in Toronto, but for family reasons. It became important to be closer to my wife's family in New York. But again, that wasn't really a decision. Yale contacted us. I never really applied for the job, but I was recruited.
Wow. And your wife as well?
Yes. Right.
So then you moved to New Haven with your whole family?
Well, we never lived in New Haven, but we moved to Connecticut. We lived nearer to New York and Stamford, yeah.
And then you would commute to Yale?
Yes.
All right. What was the process like of getting tenure at Yale?
Well, so the way it works is we already had tenure that we had first got at Notre Dame. But when you are hired at a place like Yale, they still have to go through the whole process all over again. But I didn't know much about what was going on. It's not very transparent. All I knew was I would get an occasional email from Michael Della Rocca, who was the chair of the department, who's now my colleague, saying, oh, you just got through another stage. Okay, so I don't know what was involved in that. I probably had to send them a bunch of work, and then they would have asked other people to write letters, but I had nothing to do with it. So I think the most I had to do was to submit my work, write a statement about my research and a statement about my teaching, and send it off into the void. And then everything else just happened without my knowing it was happening.
So it worked out?
It obviously did work out.
And you've been here for over 10 years?
Yes. Now I have to deal with that tenure process because I'm the head of the department, as you mentioned. So I now understand what's involved, but I didn't know anything about what was happening.
And how did you come to be the head of the department?
Well, it's a rotating position. We take turns doing it. And I was taken by surprise. I didn't know it was going to be my turn. But, it's 3 years. Often people do it for 2 or 3-year terms. This is the end of my second, beginning of my third year. And somebody has to do it. I thought I might have a different sort of administrative position, but it turned out nobody else was either ready or willing or competent to be the chair. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And then I teach less. I only teach 1 class per semester, so I miss the teaching. but I spend a lot of time in meetings and organizing things, and then running tenure processes, and I think that's very important. So a large and important part of my job is nurturing the junior faculty who are at the start of their careers, sort of trying to get them through that tenure process.
Right. And I mean, throughout your time here, how do you think that, not just your time here, but from, going from Indiana to Canada to Connecticut, like all of these experiences, have they changed? Did they impact your philosophical views a lot? And
Very
how?
much so, yes. So I think every department I've been in, I've learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues and students. But I mean, I've had really great colleagues, and I would be a fool if I hadn't tried to learn from them. So in Indiana, I had a great group of people who were working on Kant and Kantian philosophy. Unfortunately, two of them died recently. In Stanford, they were both teaching Stanford. Michael Friedman, who was my official mentor, and his wife, Graziella de Pieris, who was a wonderful Hume and Kant specialist as well. I learned a tremendous amount from them. From Michael in particular, Michael Friedman worked on Kant and mathematics, Kant and the sciences. I didn't know anything about it. Completely transformed my reading of Kant. And another colleague there was Fred Beiser, who is in Syracuse these days. I saw him last year, went to visit him. And he's one of the great historians of philosophy who has written about German idealism. So before I met him, I'd already read all of his work and was very excited about it. It was wonderful to become his colleague. When I moved to Notre Dame, I was also part of a great group. Karl Emerichs, who just died, unfortunately, it's not been a good season for philosophers of a certain age. Karl was a great Kant specialist, and he worked on a different aspect of Kant, sort of Kant and the rationalist tradition. And again, that was fairly new to me, so I learned so much from him. And Notre Dame was also great because there were people who worked really seriously on philosophy of religion from a Catholic point of view, but that was less important. The difference in religions was less important than the fact that they did it. You asked me about my book. I guess I wrote my main book, All or Nothing, while I was at Notre Dame. I said that when our first child was born, I ended up moving. So the way it worked out, I had 2 years back to back of research leave, because I already had a year that I had, or half a year that it was coming to me from Indiana, pre-tenure. I could have gone up for tenure in Indiana, but I left before that. The state of Indiana had just introduced paternity leave, so I took that as well. That together gave me a whole year while my daughter was born. And then Notre Dame was hiring me as well. And originally I thought they were going to hire me with tenure, because they had mentioned it. And at the last minute they said, well, no, we don't do that. You're going to have to go through the tenure process here, and we expect you to write a book. And so actually my wife was in that meeting, and she said, if you expect him to write a book, you should give him a year of leave to write it. And the dean said, oh, okay. That was fantastic. So I had 2 years home with my daughter when she was a baby, and I wrote 2 books during those 2 years. That was fantastic. So I wrote the first draft of what became All or Nothing, and I wrote this little book with my colleague Mike Morgan from Indiana, who remains my colleague and co-conspirator and collaborator. We're writing another book together. But we wrote a book of translations of Franz Rosenzweig, German church philosopher. So those 2 years were fantastic, in fact. And then in Toronto, there were so many people I learned from. Again, too many to even mention. It's a huge department, but I think my philosophical work has been transformed every place I've been, and that's true at Yale today as well. I'm going to co-teach a seminar in the spring with my colleague Laurie Paul, and I'm really excited about that because we're going to have a great conversation and I'm excited about her work on transformative experience. And we're going to, I've done that in other places. Co-teaching is a really good way to get to know somebody's work.
Right, definitely. You mentioned that you're writing another book. Could I ask what it's about?
Yeah, so okay, I've got at least 2 books on the boil at the moment. There is the big book that I'm writing with Mike Morgan is about 500 years of Jewish philosophy. Jewish philosophy is usually treated either as something quite separate from European philosophy in general, or as something derivative from it. And we have a very different approach, and it will go from 1490 to 1990. We've been working on that for over 10 years. It's a big project, and I think it will be really different. Then I've got a second book that I'm writing on my own, which I expect to finish more quickly, which is about the connections between German idealism and Jewish mystical tradition, because many important texts from Jewish mystical works were translated into Latin in Germany, in Sulzbach, in the 17th century, and the concepts from those works are highly important for German idealism. And then Jewish philosophy takes back, as it were, those concepts in a transformed way. And that story has not been told yet. So that book will be called An Other Spirit, and it's a whole different approach to post-Kantian philosophy, which puts it into conversation with Jewish thought.
I'm excited to read it.
I'm excited to have it written. My last research lead was 2020, and COVID happened, and I had just left home. For the first time, my kids were out of the house, and it was time for me to finally go and just sit somewhere and write a book. And that lasted 3 weeks, and then I had to come home, and the rest we all know. And then Yale needed various things from me, and I got a lot of work done, but I never finished the book.
Right.
So next year, 26, 27, that will be a year of leave. So I certainly intend to finish the shorter book.
Right. Would you say that being at Yale, Yale is known for being more rigorous, and in Ivy League school, would you say that teaching here is different from the other universities?
Not really, no. I would say that there are excellent students at any university. The difference is that at a place like Yale, they're pretty much uniformly excellent. Whereas if you teach at a big state institution, and I taught at Indiana and I did a little bit of intro teaching at Michigan, there will be some students at the bottom end of the class who are not really up to it. They might even be up to it intellectually, but they're not emotionally mature enough to be in university, so they don't do the work. I've never had that problem at Yale. The students who get in to Yale are both intellectually and emotionally able to handle the work. In terms of research, it's really not that different, because I've been fortunate enough that every place I've been has been a major research university and a department full of really great philosophers.
Sounds incredible, honestly. I didn't know that universities were. There's always this, stigma around Ivy Leagues being like much more renowned and apparently better than other universities. But it's very interesting to know that they're similar in there.
The big public universities, the major public universities, places like Berkeley, Michigan, Indiana, Rutgers, these have excellent philosophy departments. So there's not much difference. The only difference, as I say, is that while there are excellent students, there are some students who are not really up to it.
Right.
But from the point of view of faculty, they're all excellent faculty. And University of Toronto in Canada is like that as well. It's a public university. It's excellent. It's one of the best departments in the world.
Very interesting to know. I was also wondering about throughout your career as a professor, what were the expectations placed upon you by the universities you've taught at, in terms of publishing?
Well, it's, the tenure process requires publication. There has been a bit of a struggle over that over the last few decades, but the general trend has been to try to quantify your research output, which is not really a great approach. I think most of us would agree, but for deans who are trying to measure somebody's work, especially in a field they don't know, it's much easier to say, well, this person published 10 articles and that one published 5, than to say how great they were. But we all know that there are people who publish very little and maybe nothing who are great. And there are people who published, there's a famous article by Gettier, which is about 3 pages, but it's one of the most important articles in the history of epistemology. So it's not really a great way to measure it. Philosophy is a bit of a different discipline from the other humanities. In many ways, philosophy is in between humanities and the sciences. So there are some parts of philosophy where people only write articles, they don't write books. And there are other parts of philosophy where they might write a mixture like I do, but I mainly write articles. And then there might be some parts of philosophy where you mainly write books. But in the rest of the humanities, it's all about books, and you would be expected to publish not only 1 but 2 books by the time you come up for tenure, and 3 by the time you come up for full professor. Philosophy's not like that. I could tell you some funny stories about it, but there's been pressure from various administrations to try to quantify the number of things you've written, and then maybe even how many citations you have. In some fields that is very common to talk about. I can tell you now that the committee at Yale that works on tenure in the humanities will not allow discussion of the number of citations, whereas the committee within the social sciences focuses on that, because I've had to deal with cases in both.
Right.
So that's a very different approach. So at Yale, we're pretty free. As long as we can get enough people who are considered to be peers at other equally prestigious universities to say that our work is good. Now, obviously, I'm not involved in that, right? I don't recruit people to write letters about my work. Somebody else does that. I, as the head of the department, have to ask people to write about their colleagues' work. So a lot of it depends on your reputation and how well your peers in the rest of the world think of you. So at Yale, getting tenure and then getting promotion to full professor really involves primarily being considered one of the top people in a certain field in the world. And however you get that reputation, then it might be through an article, it might be through books. So I think there's less concern about what exactly the quantity is and more about that international reputation for first-class work.
Another question that I wanted to ask you is, what sacrifices, either personal or professionally, have you had to make throughout your life to sustain what you're doing?
I'm not sure if I'd call it a sacrifice, because I love what I'm doing, so I'm really grateful that somebody pays me to do it. I think I would be doing it anyway, but I had a great-grandfather on my father's side of the family who only wanted to study Talmud, but no one was paying him to do it. Apparently he was a terrible shopkeeper because he was too immersed in books. Well, okay, so I could have been doing that, but I'm doing what I love and getting paid. I think the hard part about being an academic, which is also the great part, is that it's not a 9-to-5 job. There's no real limit to it. So I could easily go home and keep working for another 3-4 hours. So work-life balance, I think, is a challenge for some people. It might be nice to switch off and say, okay, I finished for the day, close my office door. It's not really like that. Either if you're a researcher, because you've got to do the research when nothing else is happening, or if you are the head of a department or a dean or something, because then, there could be some crisis with a colleague or with a student that comes up at any time of the day and you've got to respond. And it's different now, of course this is true in many fields, because of email. You're never out of touch. So I suppose you could be very disciplined and say, I'm not going to even look at my email after 5 p.m. or something. As a department head, I don't think I can do that. So the only thing I would say is sacrifice. Probably, it's a challenge to keep work-life balance. I'm a family man. My wife is also an academic. We have our children. We have a lot of family and friends. It's good to sometimes, for the sake of mental health and sustaining our relationships, to switch off a bit. And it's hard to do. And I think part of the point of the tenure process is that you get so used to producing research that, in principle, once you've got tenure, you could say, oh, okay, that's it. I'm not going to do anything else. But most people don't do that because they've become the kind of person who's now got so many projects and constantly producing research. So at a place like Yale, that's not going to happen. And I think that's not well understood outside the industry. They might think, oh, you get tenure and then you're there. Nobody's going to criticize you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a very well-known thing. That very interesting. And lastly, I want to ask you if you have any advice for the younger generation looking to get into the field of philosophy or just into the field of teaching.
Well, what I would say about philosophy is this, or any academic field, we really don't know how many jobs, sustainable jobs, there will be in any given field in the future. As we know, we've lost a lot of jobs, and those that exist have often become adjunct positions that are not fully paid and so on, and it's a little bit sad. So what I would say is this: if you're going to go into a field like philosophy, do it because you love it and because it's something that you're going to be doing in your life regardless. I would be happy to do philosophy, as I mentioned before, even if I wasn't getting paid to do it. It just would be harder for me. And I would say if someone is going to do a PhD with the expectation of getting a job, or because they want a certain kind of job, that's not a good idea. They should be doing it because they love the subject for its intrinsic value. If you get a job, that's a bonus.
And that's all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me and thank you for your time. I think this is going to be a very interesting episode. Lastly, for the viewers, would you like to mention where we can find some of your work, some of your articles?
Oh gosh. Well, I suppose I'd have to say to look at my my Wikipedia page or at my faculty page at the Yale Philosophy Department, and you'll see a list of publications or maybe even links to them as well.
Okay, awesome. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.